81.93 trillion rupees. Give that massive figure a second to sink in, because this staggering number, it's not some worst-case scenario projection. This is the absolute reality of Pakistan's total central government debt as of April 2026.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a really measured, investigative look into the mechanics of a country that is, by many accounts, literally being kept alive on borrowed time. We're going to unpack the data and the raw structural realities of Pakistan's massive economic burden. It is a fascinating, complex story about what happens when a nation's financial math gets harder and harder to solve. And honestly, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Okay, let's dive into this by making that massive national number a bit more personal. If we break down that total debt across the entire population, this is what you get. Roughly 325,000 rupees. To put that into perspective, that's the per capita debt that every single Pakistani citizen, every man, woman, and child effectively owes before they've even earned a single rupee of their own. Section 1. Breaking down the debt.
So, we have to realize this debt isn't static, right? It is actively and rapidly growing. Between April 2025 and April 2026, the central debt spiked by nearly 7 trillion rupees. That's a massive 9.3% rise in just 12 months. And actually, when you factor in all the public liabilities, like the provinces and state enterprises, the total figure actually pushes past 83 trillion rupees.
Now, what's really interesting about this is where that money is actually owed. It's incredibly common to assume a developing country owes most of its debt to foreign powers, but look at this breakdown. The vast majority of it, about 70%, is domestic debt. This is money borrowed internally from Pakistan's own banks and domestic savings schemes. Only the remaining 30% is owed externally, though, to be fair, that still equates to well over $100 billion.
Consider the day-to-day reality for the government. In the 2026 to 2027 federal budget, out of a total 17.5 trillion rupees, a staggering 7.8 trillion goes entirely to debt servicing, basically just paying the interest in repayments. That means nearly half of the entire national budget is eaten up by past debt before a single new school is built, before a single hospital is stocked, or a single road is paved. Just let that sink in for a moment.
Section 2. 4 Paths to Debt.
So how exactly does a nation quietly arrive at over 82 trillion rupees in debt? Well, it doesn't just happen overnight. It happens through 4 compounding paths. First, there's this chronic structural issue. The government consistently spends way more than it collects, mainly due to a very narrow tax base and a huge informal economy. Second, the energy sector suffers from what's called circular debt. It's basically a massive chain of unpaid bills between power producers and the state that just keeps getting patched over with more loans. Third, we have devastating climate shocks, like the massive 2022 floods that caused tens of billions in damage. And fourth, security. Following a major standoff with India in May 2025, defense spending was increased by roughly 20%. None of these things breaks an economy all on its own, but stacked together, they create an enormous, compounding financial crater.
Section 3. The IMF and China.
Take a look at this number, 25. That is the number of times Pakistan has had to call the International Monetary Fund for a bailout arrangement since joining the institution back in 1950. 25 times. It makes Pakistan one of the most frequent borrowers on the entire planet.
And this brilliantly illustrates a very precarious dual reliance on 2 major external financial pillars. On one side, you have the IMF, which is currently providing a $7 billion extended fund facility. But that comes with incredibly strict, politically costly conditions. They're demanding higher taxes, higher energy prices, and shrunk subsidies. On the flip side, you have China. Pakistan owes Beijing roughly $69 billion, heavily tied to massive Belt and Road infrastructure lending. China frequently steps in with these multi-billion-dollar short-term rollovers just to keep Pakistan's reserves above the minimum levels required by the IMF.
Which brings us to a really critical financial concept, rolling it forward. This simply means refinancing old loans with new ones rather than actually paying the principal debt down. Many independent critics look at this pattern, leaning on China to satisfy the IMF only to take more loans later, as merely stalling the inevitable rather than solving the country's root structural problems.
Section 4. The human cost. For everyday citizens, this crisis isn't just an abstract spreadsheet. It is felt directly at the dinner table. 38%. That was the peak annual inflation rate in Pakistan in 2023. Think about what that actually does to a household. It means the price of basic necessities, food, cooking fuel, life-saving medicine, became entirely unaffordable for ordinary citizens who simply couldn't outrun the rising costs.
Let's see how this builds over time, because it creates this exhausting whiplash effect for the public. After that 38% peak in 2023, there was actually a genuine cooling period. By March 2026, inflation had dropped nicely to around 7.3%. People started to breathe a little bit. But then, just a month later, in April 2026, a fresh global shock, a war in the Middle East, drove up global oil prices. Because Pakistan is highly import-dependent, inflation immediately rebounded back to nearly 11%.
This quote perfectly captures that exhausting reality. Every external jolt, anywhere in the world, lands directly on a Karachi dinner table. It is a harsh, empathetic summary of what it means to live in an import-dependent economy. You're constantly vulnerable to volatile global events, leaving everyday families to absorb the impact of crises happening thousands of miles away.
Section 5. A precarious balancing act.
So, is the country actually stabilizing its economy, or is it merely delaying an inevitable collapse? Impartially looking at the data, there are absolutely real signs of repair here. Foreign reserves have climbed impressively from $9.4 billion to over $17 billion by mid-2026. The government actually posted a primary budget surplus in 2025, meaning they collected more than they spent if you exclude the interest payments. And the debt-to-GDP ratio has officially eased from 74% down to 70%. Government technocrats rightly point to this data as concrete proof that the painful IMF program and the structural reforms are actually working.
So the crucial point is balancing that optimism with this persistent reality. The absolute debt keeps growing every single month. Independent analysts argue that while the immediate acute crisis might be managed, the underlying structural crises, like that narrow tax base, the massive energy sector losses, and the severe climate exposure, well, they remain largely untouched. Which leaves us with this final, provocative question. Is Pakistan stabilizing or just stalling the fall? The reality is that the country is walking a very narrow ledge, taking one borrowed step at a time. It remains highly dependent on the continued goodwill of international lenders and incredibly vulnerable to whatever global or regional shock happens next. It's a fascinating, precarious balancing act, and the whole world is watching to see exactly how long that ledge holds. Thanks for exploring the data with us today on this explainer.